All right, next I want to talk a little bit about population geography, especially with India. India is the one with that huge population. And since India became independent, since that time that they were controlled by the British, their population has grown enormously. They had a very rapidly growing population. It's the second most populated country in the world, past China. And in about 20 years, 2040-ish, it's predicted to overtake China as the most populated country in the world, as we saw in the chart earlier. But overpopulation is still a lot of their farming is subsistence farming that's dependent on the rainfall. And so overpopulation is still a concern. There's always a concern about there being enough of a reliable food supply to feed the population. The Green Revolution helped to address some of this, but it's still a concern. And most of the population is rural, meaning that they don't live in cities, but live in rural areas, out in the farming areas. And one thing that we're going to see is that this used to be true of China as well, but it's no longer true. China is now a mostly urban population. However, India remains mostly a rural population, meaning not living in cities. That being said, there are some huge urban areas. And there are 7 megacities in this part of the world that are comparable to Los Angeles or New York. These are the 2 in North America. So LA, New York type urban areas, there's about 7 of these in this part of the world. And the reason for these big populations, a lot of that has to do with the rural to urban migration. As farming becomes more efficient, all these people who live out in the countryside, many of them are being pushed out of the countryside and into the urban areas. We've talked about the demographic transition model in the introduction and with Europe. And what we talked about is that when the death rate drops and the birth rates don't drop at the same rate, that the population is expanding. And this is what happened in India, that as their food supply became more stable, and new technologies, medicines, and so on, as their death rate went down, their populations really grew rather rapidly. However, demographers, people who study this, kind of look at this at different stages. Stage 1 is called pre-industrial. This is where you have, high death rate, high birth rate, pretty stable growth, not much change. Stage 2 is the rapid growth stage, where the death rate drops, but the birth rate doesn't initially. So population is growing rapidly. And then you have stage 3. This is where the birth rate starts to come down. And as the birth rate comes down, that slows the growth of the population. And then you have stage 4, which is more like Europe or the United States, where you have low death rates, but also low birth rates. So the population growth stabilizes. And if we look at fertility rates, I'm going to jump to the next slide. This is the average number of children. If we look at them in South Asia, between 2003 and 2013, you can see, in Pakistan, in most cases, except for Sri Lanka, you have a drop in the average number of children that people are having in these countries. And so if you look at this chart here, you can see where the birth rate starts to go down. This suggests that India, while has grown rapidly in the past, that the growth is starting to slow down a little bit. That over time, it's anticipated that rapid growth will decline over time. That it's kind of like a little bit behind where Europe is, and then eventually it will kind of catch up. So this is showing population pyramids, age structure diagrams for India and China. And China is kind of wacky because of government policies, but for India, they don't have government regulation so much over how many children people have. So we'll focus on India for now, and we'll come back to China later. This is in 2016, and you can see it's pretty wide pyramid. That means that it's been a growing population, but it's kind of level off here. That's showing that the growth is slowing. And in the future, it's going to keep leveling off so that it's kind of getting out of that high growth stage. And one thing I want to highlight here, though, we'll start with India in 2016. Remember that these are divided between male and female. And there is something odd here where if you look at the number scale, the female is just past 52, and that would be about there, right? So what's happening here? Like, why? In other words, there's a lot more guys than ladies, right? So what's that all about? Now, this is called the missing girls problem, and this is where in certain populations, like in India, um, the male children are outnumbering the female children. Some of that has to do with cultural, placing higher values on boys, and some of it is economic. Now, if you recall from the take-home assignment, this kind of includes like the area of Bangladesh as well. And if you recall, Jasmine, the young lady who worked in a clothing factory, why did she have to go work in a clothing factory? Why was her family in such need of that money? Right. So if you recall, the reason why the family was so poor is because she had a sister who got married, and it took all of the family's money to pay into a dowry. So having a girl be married actually kind of broke the family's finances. And so those kind of weird incentives kind of really can skew people to make choices where maybe if they have they have more boys, they stop having more kids, or they if they find out they're having a girl or a boy, they make different choices. And so, but this can lead to societal problems, like where if you have more men than women in the population, people try to couple up, and when you have an imbalance like that, that can cause, it's called bachelor angst, where you have too many men relative to women in the population. However, that's why you kind of see the skew backwards here. The idea, the thought is that as culture, as people with education and over time, that this imbalance will hopefully kind of start to correct itself over time. And also a little bit about economic geography to finish out India. One thing that's changed in India is a growth of their economies. We often have a stereotype of India, for example, being a poor country, but if you look at from 2003 to 2013, the growth in their economies, it's quite dramatic. A lot of that is attributed to what's called neoliberal reforms. And these are economic changes since the 1980s. So, so before these, a lot of the industries may have been owned by the government itself, so state-run industries. But privatizing companies, lowering tariffs, and lowering taxes, try to making the government making a more business-friendly environment has really kind of helped to increase the sort of the capitalism part of their economy, increase their ability to trade and interact with the global economy, and that's increased. So India, it's not as dramatic as China now, but India's has seen a lot of economic growth over time. However, one thing the book kind of points out is it's not even in India. You kind of have an East versus West, where the East is kind of like their old manufacturing, like their Rust Belt, kind of the older part with a lot of older manufacturing and factories, and the West is kind of the newer, more high-tech part of India. So in the East here, I think that line got a little bit. I'll just adjust it a bit. So in the East here, these are older industrial areas, a lot of it in decline, kind of like in places in the old manufacturing regions of the US, where a lot of factories have closed over time. And a lot more economic progress in the West, higher, greater connections to the outside world. Now, India has a lot of manufacturing, but compared to China, everybody compared to China has less. So it's about 1/10 of the amount of manufacturing jobs in India as you have in China. But even having 1/10 of China is still a lot. One area of their economy that they have done well in is information technology. IT jobs have become increasingly important in India. And one thing about IT jobs, though, it's a significant part of their economy, about almost 10% of their gross domestic product, but only employs about 2% of the population. It's not a, not a like where it employs a lot of people, but it's the money that it generates is very important. This is kind of showing that East versus West divide. That slide over just a bit. That kind of from the south to the west is the most well-connected part of India. I was going to say, yeah. And speaking of the IT industry, so this was a trend, kind of in the 2000s of where we've seen. Initially, the U.S. has seen manufacturing jobs be, outsourced to overseas places like Mexico and other places. Clothing industry, as we saw recently, where cheap, chasing the cheaper labor into, Colombia and Bangladesh. That this also has happened with the computer industry as well. That India has a well-educated workforce, a lot of engineers, people who are have a lot of computer knowledge. So that where possible, some of the computer functionalities have been kind of moved over to India. Also, just things like call centers, things that we've kind of stereotype that call centers are, it's like India. And one thing I'll mention about that is that why India for call centers? A lot of it is colonial history, that because it was part of the British Empire, that a relatively high percentage of the population speaks English, because English is taught in schools, that it was, part of the kind of a relic of being part of the British Empire at one time. So.